Hey, I'm Joshua Knobe from Philosophy and Cognitive Science at Yale.
And I'm Dave Rand from the Harvard Program for Evolutionary Dynamics and soon to be the Yale Department of Psychology.
Hey, so today we're going to be talking about questions about why people sometimes cooperate with each other and why sometimes they don't cooperate or sort of defect and harm each other. And in general, this tends to be a very interdisciplinary kind of approach, but your work seems to take it to a whole new level where you have this involvement with biology and psychology and computer science and also indie rock. So maybe you could just start off by just talking a little bit about, your background. How did you end up doing this kind of stuff?
I've had a strange path through topic space. But I just kept searching for something that I thought was really amazingly interesting. And the first time I heard about the idea of cooperation and the prisoner's dilemma and stuff like that, I was like, that's it. This is what I've been looking for. I started as a computer science major. I switched into biology. I did computational biology, like modeling electrical properties of heart cells and stuff like that. And then in grad school, I took an evolutionary game theory class, and I was like, wow, this is super cool. So I started doing like game theory, economics kind of stuff, running economics experiments, and then trying to say, oh, actually, it's really interesting to find out what people are actually thinking and like what people actually do. And it got into the psychology angle.
So, when you think about this psychological angle, I feel like the obvious sort of thing to think is that for people to help others or to be kind to others, what they should do is be more thoughtful, more considerate, kind of think about what they're doing and reflect. But it seems like a lot of your recent research points in exactly the opposite direction from that, suggesting that maybe if we took the time to be more considerate and more thoughtful, that would just really land us in a lot of trouble.
Right. It's a little bit unsettling. I find it a bit unsettling. So we've done, we had this paper recently with Josh Green and Martin Novak, where we showed that in these kind of social dilemma situations where you give people money and they choose how much to keep for themselves and how much to contribute, the initial impulse is to be cooperative and to contribute to the public good, and then the more you think about it, the more selfish you get. And I find it sort of alarming.
Wait, so maybe you could just tell us about the experiment. How did you actually show it?
Yeah, so we did it using economic games, so sort of using a paradigm that comes out of economics and game theory, where you have a group of people and you give everyone some money, and then they choose how much of that money to keep for themselves and how much to contribute to a common project that benefits everyone. And specifically, it's everything that gets contributed gets doubled and then split equally by everyone in the group. In our experiments, it's typically groups of 4. So it's like everyone gets money. If everyone contributes all of their money, it gets doubled, and everyone gets back double what they started with, and so that's good. It's non-zero sum. Everyone's better off by cooperating. But at the same time, there's the temptation to free ride off the contribution of others, because for every dollar you put in, it gets doubled to $2, and then split 4 ways, so you're only getting back 50 cents on the dollar. So it's one of these little simple games that illustrates the tension between what's best for the individual and what's best for the common good.
So it's kind of like maybe a group project that you get when you're an undergraduate student,
Yeah.
where there are 4 of you working on the project. If all of you put in a ton of work, you'll all get a really good grade and everything will go well. But say if 3 people put in a lot of work and 1 person puts in nothing, then the 1 person reaps all the benefits of the other 3 people's work, but actually doesn't have to do anything himself. So ends up with a nice payoff without having made any contribution.
Right, that's exactly right. And there's all kinds of examples of things like this in academic context, like you're talking about, in business context, like all kinds of, work projects. At the global level, things like environmental conservation are an example of this, where, if everyone sort of reduces their consumption, everyone will be better off. But, that's sort of individually costly for you.
Right, so you have this basic idea that people are in this public goods game, and then how do you discover what the impact is of reflecting or thinking about your actions?
So in this paper, we sort of took this canonical setup of the public goods game from economics and combined it with some sort of like canonical methodologies from social and cognitive psychology. So we sort of look at it from a dual process perspective, you know, of this decision making being the result of tension between intuitive, automatic, maybe emotional responses on the one hand, and then like slow, controlled, deliberative, reflective processes on the other hand. And so, you know, to ask, basically the question is, are we selfish animals when the only way we get ourselves to do the right thing is through rational self-control of our greedy impulses, or are we predisposed towards cooperation and doing the right thing, but then when we stop and think about it, like rationalization and the calculus of self-interest undermines that and makes us selfish. So that's the sort of framework. And then to actually get at it, we did a bunch of different experiments. Like the paper in total had 10 experiments in it or something like that. But so the first thing is you can just look at correlations with decision time. So we record how long it takes people to make their decisions, and we assume that decisions that happen faster are more automatic, and decisions that happen slower were indicative of having more reflection and deliberation there. And we see this very clear trend where people that respond quickly contribute a lot, and then the longer they think about it, the more selfish they get. And we showed that that's true in the lab with undergrads, also online using Mechanical Turk to recruit people from all around the world. And also it's true in one-shot games and repeated games and games with punishment and games with reward and so on and so forth. So that's cool, but that's just a correlation. So then we also do some actual experiments to show that there's really a causal relationship. In one set of experiments, we use time pressure, so we force some of the people to answer quickly, we force other ones to stop and think, and it does what you expect. So forcing people to respond quickly makes them contribute more, forcing them to stop and think makes them contribute less. And then finally we did a manipulation experiment that specifically invoked intuition and reflection instead of using speed as a proxy, where we did an induction. So before the experiment started, people wrote a paragraph about 4 different conditions. So either a time that they followed their intuition and it worked out well, or a time that they carefully reasoned through something and it worked out poorly. And so both of those inductions should make people more intuitive. Or they were asked to write about a time that they followed their intuition and it worked out poorly, or that they carefully reasoned through something and it worked out well. Both of those should make people relatively more reflective. And you see the same thing, where people that were primed to be intuitive contributed more than people that were primed to be reflective.
So if I really want someone to be kind to me, I should come to them when they're in the middle of 12 other things and have no ability to really think about it. And
Right. Yeah, exactly.
But you know, the puzzling thing about your results is that if I just think about my own life and the various people I know, I feel like there are these people I know who really are kind to others and are really seen as these kind of moral paragons. Everyone looks up to them. But those always seem to be these really thoughtful people who are constantly thinking a lot about things. Then when I think about actions that people take that are really harmful to others and really do a lot to make others' lives worse, when I think about the actual ones in my own, that I've observed in my own life, it hardly ever seems that it's these people who really think deeply about the question and decide, eventually, whatever, I'm just going to do this. It's just, rather, it seems to be always these kind of thoughtless people who are doing things like that. People who didn't even know what it was that they were doing, didn't really think about it properly.
Right. So, there's a bunch of different things there. I say, one thing is that, so our paper focused on within individual differences rather than across individual differences. So, you have people who in general are thoughtful and people who in general are reflective, are sort of act automatically and don't reflect. But within any individual person, we vary a ton across our decisions. Like sometimes we, really stop and think about things. Sometimes we just kind of act automatically. And by doing these manipulation experiments, we're kind of looking at that latter case where we're making people be more or less intuitive. And we actually have some experiments in the supplement where we look at individual difference measures of sort of preference for intuitive versus rational thinking. So things like the need for cognition scale, the faith and intuition scale, and the cognitive reflection test. And we actually don't find that any of those things predict cooperation.
So it might be in general what what I really need are the thoughtful people in their most thoughtless moments. I mean, the people who've developed these habits of thinking in general, but at this moment are not thinking about it at all.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Maybe they're the ones who'll be most kind.
Well, actually, so we did check for that, in that we asked whether there was an interaction. So that would sort of be a prediction of an interaction between individual differences in cognitive style and situational cognitive style, right?
Right, and you're not getting that
yeah,
interaction.
So we looked and we didn't, at least for those three measures of cognitive style, we didn't find any interaction like that.
But I guess there are two different ways of explaining what's going on here. One is that it could just be that this intuitive picture I'm getting just coming out anecdotally out of my life is mistaken, and that people who are more thoughtful people aren't actually more kind than thoughtless people. But another possible thought is that thoughtful people are more kind, but there's something different about the kind of situations we face in our lives than the kind of situation you're creating, say, in the lab or in these amateur experiments.
Right, yeah, that's definitely true. And so I think what we particularly are interested in is these like anonymous one-shot kind of situations where and we're interested in that in particular because cooperation is particularly like puzzling in those settings. And so actually the mechanism that we propose in the paper for why cooperation is intuitive is that in most of the situations in our life, it actually makes a lot of sense to be cooperative, and it's in your like self-interest to be a nice guy because there are future consequences. So like if you're a jerk, people will be a jerk back to you, you'll get a bad reputation, people won't want to interact with you, you'll cause your organization to potentially fail in competition with other organizations, all of these different kinds of mechanisms. So in general, it's actually, I think, advantageous for people to be cooperative, and I would imagine that in those kind of sort of real-world situations, deliberation wouldn't lead you to be selfish, because if you'd stop and think about it long enough, you'd realize, oh, I better be nice to Josh, otherwise I'm going to get in trouble.
So what you're saying is there is going to be this complicated interaction between how reflective a person is and which kind of situation they're in.
That's my guess.
So the kind of people that I see here in town all the time, if they really thought about how they should treat me, they'd realize that it would be a good strategy to be a decent human being. But if you're just trying to decide whether to tip the waiter in like some, restaurant you encountered on the highway, then the more you think about it, the more you'll realize, oh, I can just get away with not doing this, and I'll never suffer any consequences.
Right, exactly. And the thing is that, so I come from my sort of like cultural heritage as a studier of cooperation, having worked a lot with Martin Novak. I sort of come from a repeated games are like really important and are like the thing that matters in the world. And we wrote a lot of papers saying repeated games are the only thing that matters. And I think that that's a bit of an overstatement. So like my current thinking about this is that the things that really matter for your life success are typically repeated games. So they're your relationships with your coworkers, with your family, with your friends. And that's where I think our intuitions about successful strategies, sort of our social heuristics, are developed in those kind of contexts. But then we do also find ourselves, fairly often in situations where you could actually exploit someone and get away with it. And so the idea is the heuristics that we develop in the context of long-term relationships spill over and get applied even in the context of like, should I leave a tip for this in this restaurant in a different city? Should I lean my chair back in the airplane, and get all up in somebody else's space, like that kind of thing.
But I think that your example with the airplane is a good one. So I feel like one thing that's really striking about the particular kind of experiment you're running is that it's so obvious to the participants in the study what would be the thing that helped others and what would be the thing that helped themselves. They don't have to think to realize that they will be helping others if they donate more to the common good. But maybe a lot of the sort of douchey actions that people perform in ordinary life, it's not that they're thinking, I could be nice or I could be douchey, and then they choose the douchey option. It's that they're not thinking enough to recognize that they're in that kind of situation.
Yeah, so I think that that's totally right. And in our experiment, we really specifically did that on purpose. So we kind of were saying we're interested in the sort of cognitive mechanisms that are operating when people are in social dilemmas. So in our instructions, we like really explicitly say contributing everything is good for the group, but contributing nothing is in your sort of narrow self-interest, and like really spell it out and make sure that they understand that. But it's also a really interesting question of what's going on. That is, I think of it as like sort of a two-stage process. You have to recognize that a social dilemma is there, and then you have to decide what to do once you recognize it as a social dilemma. And so our data...
So, that's a really good... Maybe the environment example is a nice one for that. So if you think the environment situation that we're faced with right now is really like the game that you're describing, it might still be that reflective people are more the ones who are going to sacrifice from themselves to help the environment. And it's not because they're the only ones that choose altruism over selfishness. It's because they're the only ones who realize that they're in a social dilemma.
Right, and so I think that that's actually how I reconcile our results on intuitive cooperation with stuff that, for example, Moore and Lowenstein have done on ethical behavior and conflict of interest kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. There, they basically find that the reflection, that the automatic thing is to do the like non-ethical thing, and that ethical behavior requires reflection, and I think that this two-stage model is my reconciliation of that, which is that in I think a lot of the conflict of interest situations, what they're looking at is, do you realize that there's a conflict of interest here? Do you have to stop and think and realize, oh, actually, I guess maybe the reason that I want to do this isn't because it's best for the customer, but because it's good for me. And given that, what should I do? And so I think that, basically I think that there's two stages, and we were trying to sort of pull them apart and focus on the second one. But I'm actually working on some stuff now, trying to explicitly test this and sort of look at situations that are a little bit ambiguous about what's the socially optimal thing to do, and try and pull apart these two stages and look at them one at a time, and hopefully find this sort of crossover interaction where time pressure is like good for the social welfare in the second stage and bad in the first stage.
Right, maybe that helps to reconcile these two pictures I have, that once you realize you're in a social dilemma, it's best if you're thoughtless. But the only way you can... Most social dilemmas don't have a big sign on them saying, you are now in a social dilemma. The only way you can realize you're in one is if you're sort of thinking enough to realize that what you're doing might harm other people. Mm-hmm. But so that earlier you were saying the reason why cooperation is so intuitive is because of this habit we've developed of in general cooperating. Mm-hmm. But are you thinking of that as just something about human nature, that people have a habit of cooperating? Or are you thinking about it as something about the particular kind of people in this particular culture that you're examining in your studies?
I think pretty definitely the latter. And I think that we have a couple of studies at the end of the paper that provide evidence for that. So if the story is, or the hypothesized mechanism is, in the course of like development and daily life, you get reinforced as to like what is a good strategy. You learn that, and you're doing this in the context of like almost infinitely repeated games and reputation and all of that. So, you can learn that cooperation is a good strategy, and then it spills over. That makes at least a couple of predictions. So one prediction is that people that have previous experience with these economic games, the sort of pathological setting, shouldn't show the effect, or should show it less, because they've already had time to adapt. And that's what we show, is that previous experience with economic game experiments moderates the relationships. You get the sort of intuitive cooperation among the naive subjects, but not among the experienced subjects. And then the other one is that the sort of real-world context of repeated games, that can make cooperation an advantageous strategy as long as enough other people are also cooperating. But in a world where everyone is selfish, even if the game is repeated, that doesn't change the fact that being selfish is... That is, in a world of repeated games with selfish partners, you should be selfish.
So the idea is, say that the two of us were in very different environments. So say I was surrounded by these really kind, nice people who were always, helping me as long as I helped them and so forth. And then say you were surrounded by these mean people where no matter how nice you were to them, they would always sort of be mean to you
this
anyway.
This isn't a Yale Harvard dig, is it?
I wasn't the one who said that. So if that happened, then even if the two of us now say we both left and we both were just like stranded on some island or something, it would still seem intuitive to me to just be cooperative and to you to be stingy.
Right, that's exactly right, and that's what we sort of show in this experiment. We have them do one of these public goods games, and then we ask them afterwards, to what extent they can trust the people that they interact with in their daily life. And again, that individual difference moderates the effect where people that experience the world as trusting, their first response is to be cooperative, and then the longer they think about it, the more selfish they get. Whereas people that experience the world as an untrustworthy place, their automatic response is to be selfish, and then they stay selfish when they stop and think about it.
Oh, so if we would just act in a trustworthy way, then we would actually be helping not just the people that we're acting toward, but the people that they are acting toward in this kind of web that moves out.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And so there's a bunch of or a few experiments on pay it forward kind of thing, where it's like, someone gives money to me, and then I can give money to someone else, and you see that there are these pay it forward effects. And I think that a big part of how that's working is in exactly this kind of way, and that it's sort of habituating people to the norm of like what is the appropriate behavior and what can you expect other people to do and what is expected of you.
Wait, so do you think they actually have to do anything nice? What if I don't do anything at all? I'm just sitting and watching people around me, and people are just being really kind to each other and really cooperative with each other? Then would I immediately start to think of cooperation as kind of the intuitive thing that, unless I reflected further, I would just think that's the obvious thing to do. Be nice to other people.
It's a really good question, and it's something that I've been thinking about. I don't think that there's any evidence for one way or the other yet. But I think that the question, the way our mechanism, I don't know. What I was going to say is the way our mechanism is framed with this, you sort of develop a habit of cooperation and it gets internalized, would sort of suggest that experiencing, you cooperating and getting good results from that would be a more powerful thing than just seeing other people doing it. But I don't really know if I believe that. I think it would be an interesting thing to check. We have some work that we're working on now, sort of creating cultures in the lab by forcing people to interact under a set of rules where cooperation is good and everyone learns to cooperate, or one where it's bad and everyone learns to defect. And then we see that the people that sort of learned to cooperate are much more generous in subsequent one-shot game things than the people that learn to defect. But the thing is, they're still you are experiencing yourself cooperating and being rewarded for it, and you're also seeing other people cooperate a lot. So which of those is really the driving force is, I think, a super interesting open question.
It reminds me in a way of a lot of people who came to the United States from the former Soviet Union. So there was this sense that if you would cooperate with other people, it would only make life worse for you. Nothing good was going to come of that. And now, if you say to them, we're thinking of going to do this charitable work on Saturday, they just get this look of disgust and they think, oh, that's crazy talk. No one should ever do that. I'm just going to get back to my job or something. There's this sense maybe that after decades of being in a situation in which cooperating with others was never rewarded, they sort of, at least these people that I know, sort of developed an idea, maybe that was a ridiculous way to behave.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And there's actually a bunch of research on this cross-cultural things running cooperation and punishment experiments in other cities, in other countries. So Benedict Hermann and Simon Gechter are the main people that have been doing this work. And it's super interesting. I also have a project with Benedict where we went to Romania and we ran cooperation games there. And it's exactly what you're talking about, where basically people didn't... so if you just have them do individual pairwise cooperation games, repeated prisoner's dilemma kind of thing, both the U.S. Students and the Romanian students were really good. They all successfully learned to cooperate. And when you have them do sort of group cooperation things where they're playing a group public goods game, and then they're also having these sort of pairwise relationships on the side, which I think is like a model of real life, where we have group level interactions, and then we also have our personal relationships. What you see is that the Americans are willing to sort of risk their personal relationships in order to incentivize group cooperation. So basically, if you are not contributing to the group, then I won't cooperate with you in our pairwise relationship. Mm-hmm. Whereas the Romanians just basically completely ignored what was going on in the group and was like, if you help me, I'll help you, and the group can go to hell. And we asked Romanians, the professors and stuff there while we were there running about it, and they were like, oh yeah, totally, that's how everything works. Basically, post-communism, no one has any faith in any public endeavors or any sort of group endeavors, and the only way you get by is by relying on your sort of personal relationships.
So, but I was wondering, do you think, so one thing you could imagine is that after decades of living in Romania, you've just developed this certain kind of mentality, and that's the way things are. But at least you could imagine that there's something much more mutable, that you could just take those very people and say, okay, now we're going to create this certain organization. I don't know, it's like, we're going to introduce you to the world of rock and roll. And then what happens here is that different bands all help each other, and they all try to cooperate and make Romanian rock scene the best that it can possibly be. And that just in that one sphere of life, they could then start behaving that way, even if in the whole rest of life they wouldn't. So do you think it's the kind of thing that can be sort of almost instantly erased if you created a new culture? Or do you think it's something that you sort of acquire maybe when you're younger, and then it's sort of built into you by the time that you've become an adult?
I think that's a great question. And my hope is that is the kind of thing that can be remodeled in exactly the way that you're talking about. I think the extent to which that's possible is going to depend on the context. We have these experiments that I was talking about before that we're working on where you sort of can get people used to cooperating or get them used to defecting and change their behavior a lot. And I think that that's probably because people don't have a lot of previous experience with these economic games, so they don't have a very clear sense of how they should or shouldn't behave. And so I would imagine that in real-world settings where people have a lifetime of experience, it's going to be harder to push around their behavior. But I would hope that it's not impossible, and so I really want to try and do some field experiments along the lines of what you're talking about. And I think one example where you see some...
Wait,
yeah.
Can we talk a little bit more about that? So I was thinking maybe just arbitrary signals that the new thing you're doing is really different from the kind of thing you're used to could really make a big difference there. So suppose that we wanted people in a certain nation to start being more cooperative, say in their monetary interactions. What if we just change the color of the money itself, or change the names of the kind of bargains that people were involved in making, or just in certain ways just tried to create these signals that didn't actually in themselves make people more cooperative, but just made things seem really distinct from whatever had happened before. Do you think that would make people more able to think of this as some radically new thing that they shouldn't be applying their sort of traditional cultural norms to?
That's a super interesting idea. I bet that it would help. I mean, the issue is, will people sort of see through it, But I do really bet that would be helpful. That would make it sort of easier. It would make people's norms more fluid. That's a super cool idea. I have several different collaborators, including Benedict, in different places in Europe, and we really want to try and run some of these experiments in Greece, for example, where they are having some major issues, particularly.
And the goal is not just to learn some scientific truths about these people, but to kind of find some intervention that can make things better for them, to come up with some ways that they can actually cooperate.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm really interested in trying to do some science that matters in some way. And so I feel like this is an example of that where we're trying to figure out how can we design interventions that can get people to be more cooperative. Now, you always get into this sort of dangerous thing of like, oh, I don't know if like cultural imperialism is the right word, but like, oh, the Americans coming and saying that we're doing things wrong and they can fix us and make us better. So like, I mean, okay, that is what it is. But so I feel like from my perspective, I study cooperation. I want to understand why people cooperate, and I want to understand what we can do to make people cooperate more. And then if like the European Commission thinks that's cool and wants to try it, that's awesome, and I am very happy to try and work with them or whoever.
But the way that you were thinking is that if you have to change the actual incentive structure so that it becomes helpful to cooperate in general. And then if it's helpful to cooperate in general, people will cooperate, even in the cases where it isn't helpful, because it'll just become intuitive. But that's obviously really hard to do, because you'd have to change the incentive structure for all of these people. But intuitively, at least to me, it seems like a lot of the reason why people act the way they do isn't so much because of these complex, real things about the incentive structure, but because, they just admire certain other individuals, and they're just sort of imitating the way those individuals behave. Like, so that, maybe in America, people really admire certain hip-hop stars who are, in certain ways, are defecting. But if those people who were really famous and just sort of, whose behavior was really well known in our culture, were always really cooperating and trying to help other people, maybe things would become different in certain respects.
Yeah, I mean, so that's right. That's another really interesting angle that we haven't really looked or thought about at all yet, which is like role models, basically, right? And I think that relates back to the question that you asked earlier about to what extent is the relevant thing experiencing cooperation being rewarded yourself versus to what extent is it enough to see other people cooperating around you. And that's just like a more efficient way of doing that, right? Of like making high visibility people look cooperative. And so yeah, it's a really good question. And it's an experiment we should run. I mean, that's what I find so exciting about all of this stuff is it feels kind of like Wild West. Like every time I have a conversation with someone, I have at least one or two ideas of like really cool studies that I would love to run.
So what you're seeing so far is that if people think that other people are in general trustworthy, then they will tend to be cooperative in general, even in cases where it won't help them in that particular case. So that the key is somehow to give people this feeling that people are trustworthy sort of in general. Mm-hmm. Do you think maybe even the physical environment could affect that? So just say you're walking down the street, somehow there could be cues about just what the street actually looks like.
Well, this is like the graffiti, clean up the graffiti in New York, right?
Yeah. Do you think that people's decisions about whether to cooperate with others or whether to defect would actually be affected by just these physical signs of their trustworthiness, which are a lot easier to change than these much deeper kind of things that you've been manipulating so far?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it depends on whether people believe it in some sense. In that, like, the way so my guess about how that kind of stuff operates is by changing people's expectations about how others are going to behave. And so this goes back to the repeated game kind of thing where, like, as the game theorists would say, the multiple equilibria. So, like, in a world where basically having the game repeated turns it into a coordination game, where if you think the other people are going to be cooperative, then you should cooperate. And if the other people are going to be selfish, then you should be selfish. So I think that's how a lot of that kind of environmental signaling stuff works, is it's giving you information about which equilibrium you're in.
Wait, this point about the information seems like a lot of times when people are moralizing and they're trying to tell people, how important it is to cooperate, what they do is they tell some story about someone who did something untrustworthy and try to express their disapprobation of that. They try to say how wrong it was. But maybe it doesn't really matter as much how much disapprobation we express. What matters is just what people think about whether other people are being trustworthy or not. So that even a condemnation of someone for their untrustworthy acts actually just makes people more untrustworthy.
Yeah, so Cialdini has some cool experiments on this, or studies on this. Experiments, like looking at things like basically showing that what you want to do in those kind of contexts is convey the idea that most people are doing the right thing, and that by focusing on people that did the wrong thing, it's counterproductive. I totally buy that, and I think it fits with a lot of this research.
Oh, right, so maybe we don't have to necessarily change people's incentive structure. We just have to change the information they're getting so that they're getting more information about people doing the right thing and less information about people doing the wrong thing.
Yeah, well, the thing is that will only work if it actually succeeds in getting a lot of people to change their behavior. Because the thing is that, like, if you are getting information saying everybody's cooperative, but actually nobody's being cooperative, then when you experiment with being cooperative, you get a bad outcome, and you're like, oh, well, I better not do that. That is, I think that the information is important and probably will change people's behavior, but I bet that their personal experiences are even more important because you trust that more, because you really know for sure what happened in that kind of context.
Wait, that's an interesting question. I think I would slightly make the opposite guess from the one that you're making.
Okay.
So suppose we have a relationship between people who are clearly the superiors and people who are clearly subordinate, like, between, in certain kind of cases, maybe between employers and employees. And suppose it's perfectly clear to the employers in certain cases that they'll make higher profits if they do things that in certain ways harm their employees. Mm-hmm. So suppose there's no doubt about that. They're clearly going to be better off in a selfish respect if they do these things that will be harmful to their employees. Mm-hmm. But then suppose they learn that 95% of the other employers aren't doing that.
Yeah, but that's different. Right. So I think that's true, but that's different because it's not. That's like a dictator game where you have complete control over it. I think that the kind of things that I'm thinking about are like issues or situations where you have two people that have the opportunity to betray each other or not. Then it's like if you learn that everyone out there is not betraying, are like non-betrayers, and you're like, oh, okay, great, then I'll trust the other person. But actually they betray you. Then you're like, well, shit, maybe I guess that wasn't a good idea. And I think that in those cases, the sort of sting of personally getting betrayed is probably going to sting more than the sort of plus of thinking that, if everyone tells you, oh, everyone's really nice, but then in your personal experience, everyone's a jerk, it's not clear to me that the fact that people are telling you that everyone's nice is gonna win. Do you see what I mean?
Right. I think the point you're making seems right. So, at first you were saying the reason for that is that in the case where everyone else is being a jerk, then if you're nice, you get a bad outcome. But I don't think it's that, right? If we change the game to make it in such a way that when you're nice, you just definitely get a bad outcome, and there's no way that you wouldn't, and you just completely know that, and you also know that everyone else does that, then you would still do the thing that would cause the bad outcome, just because that's what everyone does.
Right. I think, I bet that that's true. I mean, that actually is an interesting question in and of itself. I bet that that's true in the short term. I don't know that if I believe that would be true in the long term.
So you think... They suppose that everyone around me gave a certain percentage of their money to charity, and it was just perfectly clear that if you kept the money, your life would be better, but no one ever did that. Do you think that over time, in the long term, I would gradually start moving more and more toward just keeping the money for myself?
I don't know. I mean, so this would be like, I think that this in some sense gets to a really fundamental question that I'm interested in, which is, where do values come from, or as economist language, where do preferences come from, and and how do preferences change? Because I don't think that preferences are fixed, and I guess it seems like there's a couple of different possible things that are interrelated in what you're asking about. So one of them is to what extent are people just straight up norm abiding? So even if there's no enforcement, even if it's like nobody else is going to know what you're going to do, you just get some pleasure in econ language. You get some utility from following the norm. And so if you've given people information about what the norm, where here by the norm, I mean, so this is another problem with talking about norms, is different people mean different things by the word norms. And so it looks like in the context that you're talking about, this is like descriptive norms, that is just what most people do, rather than like a proscriptive norm of like, this is what you should do. So if you just know that most people behave a certain way, is it that you get utility out of behaving in the same way that other people do? Or is it that you shift your preferences to match what you think other people are doing, or something, or what? Like how are these things related to each other? Seems to me like a really interesting question.
Right. Well, continuing with the idea that you originally had, it seemed like you were thinking, if other people are going to betray you, then cooperating with them is something that will end up making you start to lose money. It's going to be a bad outcome.
And
for
not
you.
just lose money, but make you pissed off and make you like psychologically unhappy.
But I think exactly the same thing would happen if we changed the game so that the people who are being helped or hurt weren't players in the game. So suppose that you and I started out with a certain amount of money, and then we could each use it to help people in the developing world. If I started out by giving a lot to the developing world, and you gave very little and just kept it for yourself, then the next round I would maybe defect and keep the money that I had for myself, even though the money that you're giving isn't in any way going to me, and none of my money is going to you.
Yeah, well, so that relates to what we were just talking about norms, right? That like, and that's the problem. Is it's hard to tease this stuff apart, but like, I think what we were talking about before is the cases where there's a contradiction or there's a tension between what's the norm and what's individually optimal in some sense. And I guess it seems to me that that tension is going to be more problematic. That is, like, in the context of giving to charity, if you know everyone around you gives to charity, and obviously it's not in your self-interest to give to charity, I bet you say, well, okay, maybe I should give to charity. But I think if it's like that there's some like serious extra punch that comes from the negative emotion of being betrayed. Like, people are really betrayal. People really hate being betrayed and are willing to reduce the amount of money they get to avoid being betrayed. And so I think that's the kind of thing that if there's a conflict between the sort of information about what's the normative behavior and your personal experience of whether other people betray you or not, that I think that they're experiencing people betraying you, even if you think most people don't do that, what makes you say, well, forget it, I'm not going to put myself out there.
So to wrap our whole discussion into a big conclusion, it seems like if we want to create a culture in which people are going to kind of intuitively cooperate, what we need to do is create institutions that make it difficult for people to betray each other.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Okay, on that optimistic note, thank you so much.
All right, thanks. That was super fun.
Okay, bye-bye.